My name is Britt Farley, and today I'm going to talk about establishing an effective, systematic remote supervision program for clients that receive ABA-based services. I have been a remote supervisor for over 2 years, and my master's and doctoral research has focused on telehealth and remote supervision in the field of ABA. By the end of the presentation, I'm hoping that you're able to define telehealth and remote supervision, along with knowing a little about the current research in the field, be able to identify and describe the key components of remote supervision program, and describe and implement best practices for a remote supervision program. So the use of technology is not new to the field of behavior. And for anyone who knows me, knows I always like to find exactly how Skinner ties into what I'm doing. So technology was first introduced by B.F. Skinner in 1953 following a trip to his daughter's 4th grade classroom. Inefficiencies were observed from unified pace of instruction and delayed performance feedback. And in order to address these flaws, he built a prototype machine that we all know as the ideal teaching machine. In 1989, Skinner identified the potential for computers to be the ideal teaching machine, setting the foundation for current research in the use of telehealth in the field of ABA. Different modalities of technology are used across fields of medicine, psychology, education, and behavior. The name commonly given to the use of technology in these fields is telehealth. Telehealth is a part of e-health, which, according to the World Health Organization, is defined as the use of information and communications technologies in support of health and health-related fields, including healthcare services, health surveillance, health literature, and health education, knowledge, and research. Current telehealth research in the field of ABA focuses on training, coaching, consultations, and assessments, focusing on parent training research, Seuss et al. In 2014 and 2016, Wacker et al. In 2013, and Malichet in 2016 examined behavior telehealth consultations, in-home functional communication training, and functional analyses. Fisher et al. In 2014 examined the effects of randomized clinical trial and virtual training program for behavior technicians to implement ABA techniques. Hidgens et al. In 2017 Can you guys all hear me? Sorry, I just got a message. Okay, perfect. That I couldn't be, okay. Hidgens et al. Did a study that evaluated telehealth training packages to teach staff members to conduct preference assessments. And Neely et al. Examines the use of telehealth practice in preparing technicians to implement incidental teaching methods. So the majority of telehealth research is focusing on parents and RBT training and coaching, and then conducting those consultations and assessments in the home. There's limited research on the use of remote supervision in ABA programming. So what about remote supervision? So ABA program supervision involves observing clients and RBTs, training RBTs, providing feedback, making program decisions, analyzing data, communicating and training parents. Remote supervision does not differ from traditional supervision when it comes to the actual tasks. The biggest difference is the modality that the supervision occurs. With the advances in video conferencing technology, behavior analytics supervision can occur remotely through live two-way audio-video communication across internet networks. This allows the supervisors to engage in ABA-based therapy sessions with RBTs, clients, and parents without having to actually be in the same physical location. The use of remote supervision in client programming has a number of benefits. Remote supervision is less intrusive and could reduce observer effect. It does not require the physical presence of another person in the session. And this can be beneficial when working with clients or RBTs who alter their behavior when the supervisor is actually in the room. It can also be for parents who alter their behavior when the supervisor shows up at the house. Remote supervision allows the supervisors to reach clients that may not otherwise have access to training or services. And there continues to be limited access to treatment for individuals diagnosed with ASD in rural and remote areas. In some rural states, BCBAs still remain low. For example, in Tennessee only has a BCBA in 16 out of the 68 counties, and the state of Idaho only has 33 BCBAs statewide. Remote supervision does not entail travel time. So in some states, such as Iowa, families have to travel anywhere between 90 to 200 miles in order to receive services. There is an increase in savings associated with no travel costs and the ability to schedule clients back-to-back with remote supervision. For example, a supervisor who has to travel 30 minutes between clients and works 9 hours a day can only see 6 clients for an hour of supervision each. A remote supervisor who works 9 hours a day can see 9 clients per hour of supervision each. So now I want to talk to you guys about the key components of remote supervision. When establishing a remote supervision program for clients, it's important to understand that modality is a large difference, but not the only one. While many of the components are similar to traditional supervision, there are some additional aspects that need to be included. So today we're going to focus on the key components that include a secure environment, interpersonal skills, building rapport, communicating, training, feedback, troubleshooting, insurance, and insurance guidelines. Okay, so the biggest thing when working with clients we know is HIPAA. So 2 components to establishing, and this is all included in the secure environment. So before we start our supervision, we want to make sure that we do have a secure environment, that it follows HIPAA and FERPA regulations, and supervisions conducted in an isolated and secure location. So you need to have video conferencing software, messaging and email software, and a secure server to store data that meets HIPAA regulations. Along with meeting HIPAA regulations in the technology, you need to make sure that you obtain appropriate release forms. If you're remotely supervising in the home, then you need parents to sign a release for video monitoring. If you're remotely supervising in a daycare or school setting, then you need parents' permission, the school or childcare, usually the director or principal's permission, the teacher's permission. And if there are going to be any other students in the room, then you are also going to need their caregiver's permission. And then it also needs to be in an isolated location. So make sure there's no one else in the room that's not authorized to observe the session, and that there's no chance of someone coming in the room interrupting the session. So think about if you were going to physically see a client. You wouldn't bring your spouse or a friend to a client's house, so don't have them in the room when you're doing remote supervision. Next is interpersonal skills. Ooh, I did not move my slide. Sorry, guys. Here's my HIPAA slide that I just discussed with the HIPAA regulations and release forms and having isolated location. And then interpersonal skills. So interpersonal skills or soft skills are used in everyday interactions, and it's commonly known that people with strong interpersonal skills tend to be more successful in their professional lives. But the trouble with remote supervision is that interpersonal skills are often left out. A remote supervisor actually has to work harder to achieve the expected outcome based on interpersonal skills than an in-person supervisor. Traditional team bonding exercises are not available when your team is remote and you're a remote supervisor, so you need to focus on ways to build team bonding through technology. For example, have a meeting and require all participants to show their face. This creates the opportunity for eye contact and identifying facial expressions, or come up with an activity that can be done using video conferencing. For example, a common team building is the 2 truths and a lie. You can do that remotely, or give the team a problem to solve and assign each team member. One person can only type to solve the problem, one person can only talk to solve the problem, and one person has to use a notepad to communicate in order to solve the problem. As a supervisor, send out weekly motivating quotes or memes, create Facebook pages that allow the RBTs to connect and communicate. There are so many ways to use interpersonal skills as a remote supervisor. You just might have to actually put a little extra effort and time into identifying them and setting goals to meet them. Along with interpersonal skills, building rapport is a vital component of remote supervision. It's important to build rapport with parents, RBTs, and clients. So when parents first hear about someone videoing in and providing remote supervision, typically they're not at all excited. So it's vital to make a good first impression with phone calls, setting up a video meeting initially before the supervision even happens to give them an idea of what occurs, and then also utilizing your email. Building rapport with your RBT is important because they don't actually get to see you in person, so you need to be able to relate to them, explain your process, and then going the extra mile to build respect and confidence. Don't forget about the clients when you're building rapport. So it is possible to pair with a client using video chat similar to being in person. There are a number of clients I work with that talking to me through the computer is used as a motivator to complete the task. And then we also established it as a reinforcer built into their program. So there's ways to build rapport when you only have a computer and a video and other technology to do so. So next is communication. Communication is a key component to any supervision, but with remote supervision, it's important to have clear and concise communication with parents, RBTs, and with clients. So transparency is important when discussing remote supervision and what all it will entail. Make sure everyone involved knows exactly what remote supervision is, how it will occur, and what exactly it will look like. Notification is a huge component. So make sure you're notifying parents and RBTs when the supervision will occur. Make sure you give adequate notification. And remember that even though you are not physically in the house, you're still a part of the environment. So I know some parents don't like to be on video, so they definitely like to know when I'm going to be videoing in. Being in home, they like to have the home look a certain way. So it's just definitely important to notify parents when the supervision is going to occur. Also, if you're supervising in the school or in a child care, it's important to give adequate notification because the child might have to be moved to a different room, or there might need to be special accommodations made because you are remote supervising in. And then collaboration. So for example, the company I work for, we work very collaboratively. So there's more than just me remote supervising in. So it's important to work collaboratively with other supervisors, letting the family know that we work collaboratively, also working collaboratively with the parents and the RBTs. That's going to help you build and maintain that rapport. So overall, communication, and it's a very big stress to make sure that you have that open communication when you are remote supervising. So training, most of you probably recognize the BST model, and this can still be used in remote supervision. It just might look a little different. Instruction can be provided prior to the session or during the session or both. The biggest difference might be in modeling. So instead of being in the session, showing the RBT or parent exactly how to perform the skill live, that's done through technology. Most of the modeling is going to be done in vivo. However, there has been remote supervision sessions where I have turned on my computer and ran some basic establishing motivation, prompt fading, basic skills through technology. And this can be done. It's just you have to know exactly what your target is when you're doing it. So it can still be done live, but the majority of the modeling is going to be done in vivo. Rehearsal can be done during the session, or they can record themselves performing the skill and submit it to the supervisor, or you can have a session with them outside of the actual supervision session. And then feedback continues as an aspect of the BST model, but it also occurs throughout supervision. So we're going to talk a little more about that one later. Okay, so feedback. Feedback should be clear and consistent. When you're running a remote supervision, you lose the physical presence of being in the environment. As supervisors, it's common to give that automatic feedback in the situation when you're there, but this isn't always possible with remote supervision. So remote supervision creates a distance between the supervisor and the parent, client, or RBT, making it important for the feedback to occur. And then feedback does not only apply to the RBT, but also to the parent and the client. You want to make sure that parents are getting feedback on their child's progress and what the RBT is doing. And it's also okay to jump in and give feedback to the client. For example, if they complete a task or a goal that they've been working on and they do it flawlessly and they maybe deserve a little extra praise for completing it, don't be afraid to jump in and give them that praise. The next is troubleshooting. Now, as we can tell from the beginning of this presentation, technology is not always our friend. And problems with technology, they're going to happen. So the best is to try to be prepared for them. So regarding technical difficulties, supervisors and trainees should be familiar with video conferencing software that's used, ensure that they require the hardware for the high quality video conferencing, and be familiar with the steps for starting the supervision, downloading the software. It's always good to do a trial run. I know when we get new RBTs on, we go through the process and what it actually entails, and then we make sure that they are able to pull up video before their first supervision session. When discussing ethical guidelines, this refers back to creating that secure environment. So if you know these guidelines are not being followed, then they definitely need to be addressed. And then guarantee support during high-risk situations. It's important to develop a plan with the RBT and parent so that either an on-site supervisor can be available, or the supervisor, if you're not in an actual remote supervision session, that you can be reached by phone if there is a high-risk situation. I know there's been times when an RBT has been in a non-compliant behavior and they're not 100% sure it's a behavior change that they've never seen before, so they need me to jump on video real quick. So make sure you have some type of crisis intervention plan for handling high-risk situations. And then my favorite technical difficulty that we run into is being forgotten. I have been forgotten. The computer has been forgotten in a number of places. I've been put into pockets when I'm in a smaller device. So just coming up with tools and tasks to prompt your RBT that if you are forgotten and they need to come back and get you, or if there's something else that needs to be done for them not to forget you. All right, and finally, know your insurance guidelines. Here are some questions to ask when looking at insurance guidelines. So does the insurance allow remote supervision? And what are the guidelines for remote supervision? And how do you bill for remote supervision? So not all insurance companies will reimburse for remote supervision. So make sure you have an insurance company that does before conducting remote supervision. If the insurance does allow remote supervision, know what their guidelines are. For example, some insurances allow remote supervision, but they also require the client to be seen in person. And then finally, know how to bill for remote supervision. So most companies that accept remote supervision often have a modifier added to the code when remote supervision is used. Okay, so I've reviewed with you guys the key components to a remote supervision program. Now I want to go over some what not to do's. So do not hide behind the scenes. Remember that you are still the one making program decisions, so you need to be able to build trust and reassurance with both the RBTs and the parents. And it's also good to let clients know who's behind the computer every once in a while, especially with those older or high-functioning clients, letting them know who's going to be in watching them. Do not multitask. This one is probably the hardest because you're sitting behind your computer. You have a huge to-do list as a supervisor, but when you're on supervision, you want to make sure and give that case your full attention. You wouldn't be sitting in a client's house and pulling up data from another client. You'd want to make sure that you were working on the current client's data. And then again, feedback. Do not forget feedback. It's easy to move from one supervision to the next, thinking you'll do your feedback and notes at the end of the day, but this task is easy to forget. And you want to make sure you're doing supervision feedback as the sessions are occurring. And then do not drop communication. Remember, communicate, and communicate some more. Make sure you're checking in with parents and RBTs outside of the supervision session. And I typically will prompt supervisors who specifically are remote to do this at least once or twice a week outside of when they're actually scheduled for supervision. And then don't think it's easy. Being a remote supervisor is hard work. You might do the majority of your work from home, but it's important to make yourself even more available than you might if you're in person, because you want to build that trust and that relationship with the family. Okay, so we've looked at key components, we've looked at what not to do, and now I want to talk about what a remote supervision program actually looks like. I was initially going to put this into a flow chart, but as I got moving forward, it doesn't always flow the same. So like we create individualized client programmings in the field of autism, you're going to create an individualized remote supervision program. But the programs might be individualized, but they should also all include some form of an antecedent, asking for questions or concerns, observation and assessment, feedback during the session, ending the supervision session, and then following up with feedback. So looking at your antecedent events. So this can include a week before the supervision session, starting up when the supervision occurs, anything that leads up to the supervision. So as I said before, notification. So notifying the parent and RBT that the supervision is going to occur. Some parents ask for a month in advance, but make sure you are communicating with that parent and understand how far in advance that they want to know notification of the supervision will occur. Follow up with feedback from the previous session. So this can occur either at the very beginning of a session, or it can occur before the actual supervision session happens. But make sure you follow up with feedback, or follow up on the feedback you gave the RBT from the last session that you had. And then sometimes making the camera or computer a part of every session. So I did work with a client once that we had to always have the RBT's computer open, because they could tell when I would come on, even if I didn't put my screen black, they knew I was there because the computer was open, and that would alter the behavior. So we started always having the computer open during our sessions to make it a regular part of the environment. And then when you enter the session, so this can be done in a number of ways. You can enter with your screen blacked out, which I would suggest doing if you're entering in the middle or after the session has already started. You can enter with your screen showing your face automatically coming on. And then you can enter with a greeting, or you can just enter without saying anything. So this definitely depends on the client and when I'm entering a session, because you don't want to enter a session and possibly a attention maintained behavior is occurring, and you pop on with your screen and start saying, hey, to the client and giving them attention, because that could reinforce the behavior that you're trying to decrease. So definitely know your client, know your RBT, and make that decision based on those components. Asking questions. So making sure that you ask the parents and RBTs for questions or concerns. When you're doing a in-person supervision, typically this is done when you get to the home and you say hi to the parents or hi to the RBT. But for remote supervision, like I said earlier, if you jump on with your screen, you might be interrupting something. So this can either be done prior to the supervision session, at the beginning of the supervision session, or when the parent is available. But this gives you feedback, gives you specifics to look at in your supervision, and it also allows the parent and RBT to have a higher stake in the actual programming, which again will build rapport, which we definitely want to continue working on while we are doing supervision. And then, so the actual observation and assessment that occurs during a supervision session, again, this looks different for clients. So the majority of sessions, I suggest blocking out your screen. This reduces observer effect. However, this does not always need to be done. There's some sessions that happen when I have a really interactive parent, and during that session, I'm going to keep my screen on, because if I turn my screen off, it would almost be equivalent to me ignoring the parent's questions when I was there in person. Make sure that you are focusing on that client when you're in the supervision. So reviewing program data while you're doing the supervision, looking at the goals, making notes for what changes need to be done, focusing on how the actual program is being ran, and then take notes. So take notes for feedback, take notes for program updates, and take notes on any concerns that were previously brought up by the parents or the RBTs. And then, again, some more feedback. Again, like I said, feedback is really important because it's that foundation of supervision in general, but it also creates so many more opportunities for you to build rapport. So providing feedback during the session can be distracting, but it could also be important. So during remote supervision, you can give spontaneous feedback if it absolutely needs to happen. So say there is attention being brought to an attention maintained maladaptive behavior that needs to stop, you can prompt the RBT to ignore. And you can do this in a number of ways, making sure all of your communication is HIPAA secure. So for example, if you're using a secure messaging system, you can just type in ignore, and that prompts the RBT to ignore. You don't actually have to jump on the computer and say ignore. But if there's something else happening and you need to jump in immediately, don't be afraid to jump in and turn your screen on, even if it is distracting. It's important that we are still focusing on safety and reliability of actual programming and clients. So you can also plan times to give feedback during remote supervision. So for example, doing a mid-session check-in can be planned. So if you're doing a 2-hour supervision, making sure that the RBT is checking your screen for feedback every 30 minutes or every 15, depending on how new the RBT is, because you can use that chat box for feedback. Building feedback into breaks. If you have a client whose break time or choice of activity, they don't want the RBT necessarily directly interacting with them, then take it as a chance for the RBT to just pull the computer aside for a minute and give them some feedback. And then again, demonstrate if you need to. If you are implementing a new motor imitation, but you need to test baseline first, and the RBT teaches the skill before they test baseline, jump in and give them a direct example of how to test baseline without teaching the skill. So there's so many different ways to give feedback. Again, it will just depend on your client and how you want the program ran. And then ending the supervision session. So again, this can be done differently. You can end it by just terminating the session and not actually saying that you're leaving the session. You can notify both the client and the RBT or the parent that you're leaving. And then you can also stay on the session until the RBT leaves the house. So there's definitely different options for ending your session. And again, that will depend on the client and the type of supervision program you're wanting to implement. Some more feedback. So feedback after the remote supervision can occur in a number of different forms. So again, instead of actually terminating the session, you can continue the call with the RBT and then go over the feedback. You can make an additional call following the session, and you can send an email with written feedback or complete the supervision form. So when you're a remote supervisor and you're doing, especially if you're just doing remote supervision, I would suggest a combination of both written and vocal feedback. So this allows the RBT to hear the feedback and have it written and review it later. For parents, I would also suggest following up with a phone call and an email after the session. It's the same if you're supervising in person, you'd give that immediate feedback before you left the house. The parents would get to see you, they'd get to hear what was said, and this doesn't always occur with remote supervision. So I always want to suggest doing 2 forms of feedback, again, that maintains communication and continues to build rapport while you are a remote supervisor. So a common misconception about remote supervision, again, is that it's easy. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not easy. It's often called easy because you don't have to drive anywhere and you just get to sit behind your computer. But this isn't the case. Being a successful remote supervisor is hard work and requires you to go the extra mile. So tasks and relationships that come more fluid and natural when you're in person take extra effort when you're a remote supervisor. Specifically building parent buy-in to remote supervision. Sometimes when you get a new client and they hear you're just remote supervising, you have to give them a little extra attention and make yourself more available than actually physically being in their house. And then it's easy to lose support or respect when you're a remote supervisor if you don't continue to communicate and build rapport and provide feedback. I know that it seems that I keep perseverating on communication, rapport, and feedback, but those really are major components to a successful remote supervision program. So being a remote supervisor for me isn't necessarily just a job, but it's something that I'm very passionate about doing and creating programs that are successful and that we get insurance buy-in, caregiver buy-in, school buy-in. I grew up in rural Iowa and I saw the lack of services provided. I am a military spouse and I provide services to military clients. So I commonly see more than we need to interruptions in service or a delay of services that could easily be addressed using remote supervision. So I hope that the information I provided today addresses any concerns or apprehension about using remote supervision. And if you want any additional information or sources mentioned today, please feel free to contact me, use the email listed. I'd love to answer any additional questions that you guys have right now about remote supervision or anything in general.